In a world that often celebrates inclusion, there are places where being different means you don't quite belong. For my son, a disabled young boy in a wheelchair, the playground, a place meant for laughter, joy, and freedom, has always felt more like a battlefield. To others, it's a space filled with innocent games and friendships. But to him, it's a place where the weight of stares and judgment hangs heavy in the air. Every day, as he rolls through the gates of school, he knows that the playground, instead of being a haven, is a battleground for acceptance. It's the looks from children who don't understand, the whispers from parents who don't see him as a child, and the unsolicited comments that sting his confidence like the harshest winds. They don't know that inside that wheelchair is the heart of a child who just wants to play, to belong, to feel normal. Despite the difficulties, my son never let the challenges defeat him. He'd roll up to the swings, the basketball courts, and the jungle gym, not out of obligation, but because he yearned for the same experiences as any other child. Every small victory, a child letting him join their game, a teacher offering him encouragement, meant the world to him. But each time, there was a lurking shadow, a silent warning that he was different, a constant reminder that the world wasn't ready for him to be exactly who he was. One of those seemingly harmless moments happened on an otherwise ordinary morning. The sun shone brightly, casting long shadows across the playground, where children ran, laughed, and competed. For most, it was just another day in their carefree world. But for my son, it was another round of navigating this place where he didn't quite fit, where the rules seemed to change for him, and where every moment felt like a test of his worth. That's when she appeared, a woman who, at first glance, seemed harmless enough. She stood by the fence, watching the children with a sharpness in her eyes that belied her pleasant enough exterior. To my son, she was just another figure in the background, another adult on the periphery of his world, a person he'd likely never have to engage with. But she was paying attention more than anyone else, more than I realized at that moment. And as she watched him, something shifted. The air around her seemed to thicken, the warm breeze now suddenly too cold. Her gaze was not the gentle, observing one of a concerned adult, but something else entirely, a gaze that bore into my son, sizing him up, measuring him not as a child, but as a problem. At first, her words were indirect, barely audible. A comment here, a slight glance there. But I could tell she was forming an opinion. There's a look that some people give you when they've already made up their mind about who you are and what you're worth. My son, in his innocence, didn't yet understand. But I could feel it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way she held herself, as if ready to pounce on any perceived flaw or disruption. In her eyes, he wasn't a child with a disability, he was a nuisance. In her world, he didn't deserve a place at that playground, not because of anything he had done, but simply because he existed as he was. A child in a wheelchair didn't belong there in her view, and the harshness of that belief began to surface in the form of her comments. It's not always the loudest criticisms that hurt the most. Sometimes it's the quiet, underhanded remarks that stick with you. "He doesn't belong here," she muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. "This isn't a daycare for troubled kids." There's no anger in her voice, but the cruelty was evident. She wasn't yelling, she didn't need to. The judgment was embedded in her words, thinly veiled in a feigned concern that only served to make it worse. Her comments were not about him. They were about his existence in this space. He wasn't welcome here, not because he hadn't done anything wrong, but simply because he was different, and that difference made her uncomfortable. I watched as she turned away, as if her judgment had already been cast, and I felt a burning anger rise within me. This wasn't just about a single remark or a fleeting moment of discomfort. This was about something much deeper, something many people like my son face every single day. It's the insidious, quiet rejection that happens without a second thought. The type of rejection that's just under the surface, but cuts deeper than any overt act of cruelty. She wasn't just making a comment about him. She was making a statement about his place in the world. In that moment, I realized something I had never wanted to admit. The world my son was trying so hard to belong to, the world that should have accepted him, wasn't ready for him. And it terrified me. The darkness of that thought lingered long after she was gone. It wasn't just her words that stung, it was the reality that her type of thinking wasn't unique. It was shared by so many others, often quietly, almost imperceptibly, but no less damaging. As the day wore on, my son remained blissfully unaware of the battle raging around him. But I could feel it, and in the pit of my stomach, I knew that the peace we'd fought so hard for was about to be shattered in a way no one could have expected. The real challenge had only just begun. The morning had started like any other. The soft hum of the school bell rang through the air, signaling the beginning of another day. My son, as excited as ever, rolled into the schoolyard, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. He was no different from any other child at the school. He was full of dreams, full of hopes, and full of the excitement that only a child could possess. Despite the wheelchair, despite the struggles, he was still just a boy. A boy who longed for friends, who wanted to run around and play, to laugh, and to share in the carefree moments that every child should experience. For him, every day was an opportunity to live as fully as possible, to prove that being different didn't mean being less. We didn't expect much that day, just the usual routine. The morning assembly, followed by playtime, then lessons. I watched as my son maneuvered his wheelchair with skill, as he effortlessly joined his friends in the activities that made him happiest. He was laughing, chatting with his classmates, and even participating in the games they played. It wasn't always easy for him, but he had a determination that amazed me. He never let the physical limitations slow him down, and he was happy, truly happy. His joy was infectious, and it didn't take long for others to join in his laughter, to see him not as a disabled child, but as one of their own. But as the day wore on, I started to feel a growing unease. It wasn't something I could explain, but there was a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the other children started to look at him differently, their smiles fading ever so slightly when he approached. Maybe it was the whispers that seemed to follow him, so soft that they could have been dismissed as mere imagination. But I couldn't ignore it. I knew something wasn't right. I watched from the sidelines as my son rolled toward the swings, his face lighting up as he joined the other children. It was a sight that should have filled my heart with pride, but instead, there was a knot in my stomach. It was as if the air had thickened, the fun and laughter becoming distant sounds, replaced by an undercurrent of tension. I couldn't quite place it, but I knew something was off. That's when I saw her again. The woman who had been watching from the fence earlier, her gaze fixed on my son. At first, I had thought little of it. After all, parents watch over their children, and she seemed like any other concerned adult. But as I looked closer, I saw the way her eyes narrowed, the way her body stiffened with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. She was no longer just a bystander. She had a purpose in mind, and that purpose wasn't one of kindness. Her eyes followed my son's every move as he swung back and forth, laughing with his friends. I could feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on him. It was as if she was measuring him, analyzing him, sizing him up for something that I couldn't yet comprehend. It made me uncomfortable, but I dismissed it, hoping that I was just being paranoid. But then she made her move. Without warning, she stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, and positioned herself near the swings. My son, oblivious to her presence, continued to play, his face radiant with joy. But I could see the subtle change in the dynamics of the group. The other children hesitated, their laughter stuttering, as if waiting for her next move. My son, who had been the center of attention moments ago, suddenly found himself on the periphery, his friends slowly backing away. It wasn't a visible rejection, but the shift was undeniable. And then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make every word feel like a slap to the face. "That's enough, don't you think?" she said, her eyes never leaving my son. "It's not a daycare. We don't have time for these distractions." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. It took a moment for the full impact to settle in, but when it did, I felt the air leave my lungs. The judgment, so clear in her voice, was more than just a remark. It was an indictment. She was speaking not just to my son, but to every person who had ever dared to step out of line, to be different. The playground, a space meant for inclusion, was now tainted by the harsh reality that not everyone saw it that way. I could feel the tension rise, the discomfort that had been building throughout the morning now coming to a head. I watched as my son turned, his face a mix of confusion and hurt, unsure of what had just happened. The playground, once a place of freedom, had become a battleground for acceptance. The other children, unsure of what to do, began to scatter, leaving him alone, vulnerable to the weight of her words. But it didn't stop there. I saw her eyes narrow even more, as if she had just decided that my son's presence was an offense that needed to be rectified. "I've seen enough," she muttered under her breath. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving a trail of uncertainty in her wake. My son, still unaware of the full extent of what had just transpired, rolled toward me, his smile dimming ever so slightly. He didn't understand why his friends had suddenly drifted away, why the laughter had stopped. As I looked at him, I felt my heart break. He had done nothing wrong. All he wanted was to be a part of something, to be included. Yet in that moment, I saw how fragile the world could be, how easily acceptance could slip away, how quickly a moment of joy could turn into one of isolation. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the damage had been done. The playground, once a place of freedom, now felt like a cage, a place where my son would have to fight harder than ever just to be seen. And as I looked at him, I knew that this was only the beginning. The world was not ready for him yet, but I wasn't going to let that stop him. And more importantly, I wasn't going to let her or anyone else make him feel like he didn't belong. This was just the start of a much bigger fight, one that would take everything we had to win. And I was ready. The days that followed seemed to blend together, each one feeling more like the last, like a repeated loop of discomfort and unease. My son still looked forward to school, still eagerly rolled through the gates with a smile, but there was an unspoken tension in the air that I couldn't shake. I knew what had happened on that day, the subtle but harsh rejection he'd faced, and it weighed on me. The feeling of being an outsider in a place where he should have felt safe, where he should have been welcomed, lingered like a dark cloud. Each morning, I watched as he greeted his friends, his wheelchair becoming his armor against the world. But it wasn't the physical challenge that worried me, it was the emotional one. I could see the change in him. His bright eyes, once full of excitement, now held a hint of doubt, a shadow of uncertainty. He would roll toward the playground with the same enthusiasm, but as soon as he reached the swings, I saw the hesitation in his movements. He would glance around, searching for his friends, but they weren't always there. The playground had become a place of quiet judgment, and I could feel him struggling to navigate through it. It was on one of these mornings that the tension finally broke, not with a loud outburst, but with a whisper, a subtle shift in the dynamics of the schoolyard that no one noticed but me. I saw her again, the woman who had made the first mark on my son's spirit. She stood by the fence, her eyes fixed on him once more, her gaze not the indifferent observation of a parent, but the cold scrutiny of someone who had made up their mind. It wasn't just about the wheelchair anymore. It was about who he was, who he represented, and the unsettling feeling that she had no room in her world for someone like him. I tried to focus on my son, who was now on the swings, his smile returning to his face as he joined a group of other children. But I couldn't stop watching her. She wasn't just observing this time. No, she was planning something. The air had shifted again, this time heavier than before. I could feel it. It was as though every movement she made was deliberate, as if she had an agenda. And then it happened. The first whisper. At first, I thought it was nothing more than a passing comment, a moment of frustration that everyone experiences from time to time. But when I heard the words, my stomach dropped. He doesn't belong here. It was subtle, just a mutter under her breath, but it was loud enough for me to hear. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it felt like a direct attack on my son. I watched her, and for the first time, I saw something different in her, a coldness in her eyes that went beyond simple judgment. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was angry. Angry at the fact that my son had the audacity to be in that playground, to take up space that she felt was hers to control. Angry that my son existed in a way that she didn't understand and worse, didn't want to. My son, oblivious to the silent battle that was unfolding around him, continued to swing higher and higher, his laughter ringing out in the air, echoing across the playground. The joy that should have been the loudest sound, the one that made everything else fade into the background, now seemed like an act of defiance. My son, in his innocence, was daring to be happy in a place that wasn't prepared for him. I didn't know it then, but those words, asterisk, he doesn't belong here, asterisk, were the spark. The moment that looking back would ignite everything that was to come. For a while, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that perhaps I was overreacting. But as the days wore on, the tension escalated. The whispers grew louder, the glances sharper. I could see how the other parents started to look at me differently, as if we didn't fit into their carefully constructed world. I could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken rules that excluded us. The turning point came one afternoon when my son was playing near the basketball court. A group of kids had gathered, and as usual, my son rolled up to join them. He wasn't expecting anything more than to shoot a few hoops, to be part of the game. But as he approached, one of the boys, a tall, athletic kid with a look of indifference, glanced at him and then turned away. My son didn't notice it at first, but I did. The rejection wasn't overt, but it was real. The group had turned their backs on him without saying a word. They had moved on without him, and my heart broke as I watched it unfold. It was the first time he had truly been left out. The first time he had felt the weight of their exclusion. I rushed over to him, trying to brush it off, trying to make light of the situation, but deep down I knew. I knew this was just the beginning. This was not a game. This was not about the playground anymore. It was about something much larger, the battle for his place in a world that wasn't built for him. As I looked into my son's eyes, I saw the confusion and hurt there. He didn't understand why they didn't want him to play. He didn't know what he had done wrong. And in that moment, neither did I. I wished I could shield him from the world that was closing in on him, but I knew that wasn't possible. The truth was, there were people like her, people who saw differences as something to be erased, something to be hidden away, people who believed that those who didn't fit into their narrow view of the world didn't deserve a place at the table. The spark had been lit, and now it was only a matter of time before it would ignite into something much bigger than either of us could have imagined. The real battle was about to begin, and I wasn't about to let my son face it alone. Days passed, and the quiet tension at the school playground began to escalate into something much more ominous. My son, once so full of joy and innocence, now approached each school day with a hesitation that was impossible to ignore. He would roll through the gates, his eyes scanning the playground, looking for a sign that things might be different, that today, maybe he wouldn't be the one left behind. But as time went on, I could see the fear creeping into his heart, the subtle rejection from the other children, the cold stares from some parents. It was all taking its toll. He was no longer just trying to be a part of the game. He was fighting to prove that he deserved to be there, that he belonged. It started with small things, whispers when he entered the playground, sideways glances, the faint but unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. But it didn't stop there. The woman, the one who had made that offhand comment before, started to make herself known more frequently. Her presence, once a distant part of the playground's backdrop, now seemed like a constant shadow. It was as if she had decided that she was going to be the one to control who was welcome and who wasn't. I watched her approach my son one afternoon, her steps purposeful and unyielding. She wasn't just standing on the sidelines anymore. She was actively inserting herself into his world. The playground, once a place of carefree laughter, now felt like an arena where my son was being tested, where his presence was a point of contention. She had taken it upon herself to police the space, to ensure that only those she deemed worthy were allowed to play. "Isn't it a bit too much for him?" she said, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp knife. My son, unaware of her intentions, continued to roll his wheelchair toward the swings. He was just trying to get to a place where he could be with his friends, where he could laugh and forget about the world's cruel limitations. But she blocked his way, her posture rigid, almost accusing. Her words were loaded with judgment, each one wrapped in a thin veneer of concern. "He doesn't belong here," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear. "This is a playground, not a charity event." I could see the way her words landed, how they cut through the air like a storm. My son faltered for a moment, looking up at her, confusion and hurt clouding his features. The other children, who had been playing nearby, paused in their games and began to retreat. Slowly, one by one, they distanced themselves from him, as if they too were afraid of the looming figure that had made her presence known. The playground had transformed from a place of joy into an unsettling space filled with isolation. I could feel it. The walls were closing in. The woman's gaze didn't waver as she looked down at my son. "He's just in the way," she continued, her words now sharper. "These kids shouldn't have to play around him. He's a distraction. A problem." I could feel my blood boil. Her words were more than just cruel. They were a direct attack on my son's right to exist, to be seen, to be a child. But I knew I had to stay calm, to protect him from the storm that was gathering around him. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The playground, the place where he had always felt a sense of freedom, now felt like an impossible hurdle. It was no longer just about playing games. It was about survival, about navigating the invisible barriers that people like her had created. I tried to step in, to shield my son from her harsh words. But she wasn't done. "You're not helping him," she spat. "You're enabling him to stay in this little bubble of delusion where he thinks he can be like everyone else. He's not. He'll never be." Her voice was cold and final. It wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the intent behind them. She wasn't speaking from a place of concern or care. She was speaking from a place of superiority, of entitlement. She had decided that my son didn't deserve to take up space, that his existence was somehow an inconvenience to her and to the world she inhabited. The moment hung in the air, and for a split second, I wondered if she truly believed what she was saying. Or was it just an excuse for her own discomfort with anything that didn't fit neatly into her narrow worldview? It didn't matter. What mattered was that this woman had made it her mission to erase my son's place in the world, to make him feel invisible, like his life didn't matter. The other children, seeing the growing tension, slowly began to drift away. One by one, they disappeared into the distance, leaving my son standing alone, uncertain of his place. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer the boy who had been able to laugh and play without hesitation. Now he was just another child trying to find his way through a world that had already decided he wasn't enough. The woman's words rang in my ears long after she had turned and walked away. "He doesn't belong here." I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right, that she had decided this for him and for everyone else. The playground, the one space where children should be allowed to just be, had turned into something else entirely. It had become a place of exclusion, of judgment, and I could feel it seeping into my son's spirit. As I stood there, watching my son retreat into the shadows of the playground, I knew that this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about a single encounter with an angry woman. This was about a larger battle, one that would require all the strength and resilience I could muster. The stakes had been raised, and I wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, erase my son's right to exist in this world. The fight had only just begun, and it was one I wasn't willing to lose. It's one thing to feel the creeping discomfort of rejection. It's another entirely to face it head-on in a moment that shatters any sense of security you thought you had. The following days after the incident with the woman only added fuel to a fire that was starting to burn out of control. My son's demeanor changed, slowly at first, like a flicker of hesitation before a storm. I watched him with a mixture of sorrow and helplessness as he no longer approached the playground with his usual excitement. His wheelchair had become more than just a mode of transport. It had become a shield, something he relied on to protect himself from a world that was no longer welcoming. He began to hold back. Instead of joining his friends at the swings, he rolled toward the edge of the playground, sitting quietly on the sidelines. The swing sets, once a source of pure joy for him, now seemed like distant memories. The laughter of the other children echoed through the air, but my son was disconnected, lost in his own thoughts. Every time he tried to join in, he would face the stares, the whispers, and the subtle but painful rejection that made him pull away even further. It was as though he had been marked in some way, branded by that first encounter, and nothing could erase it. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, I saw her again. She had been there in the background, watching, always watching, but this time, something was different. There was a coldness in her demeanor that sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't just a figure in the distance anymore. She had become the focal point of my son's daily battles, an ever-present reminder that he didn't belong in her world. It wasn't enough that she had made her judgment clear. No, now she was actively trying to push him out, to make him see that he was an outsider, that his place was elsewhere. This time, however, it wasn't just the subtle whispers and glances. This time, it was a confrontation, a direct clash that would set everything in motion. My son, still trying to navigate the new normal of the playground, rolled up to a group of children who were playing catch. They had been playing together for a while, their laughter echoing around the playground, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe he could join in, maybe today would be different. But as he wheeled closer, I saw it, the shift in the energy around him. The children hesitated. They looked at each other, and then they looked at him. And in that instant, they parted, leaving him standing there, isolated, as they continued their game without him. I could feel my heart tighten. The moment was so small, so seemingly insignificant, but the hurt was evident on my son's face. He didn't understand why they had done it. He didn't know why he was being left out. I could see the confusion in his eyes as he looked around at the children who had once welcomed him, but now seemed to be avoiding him. And that's when I saw her again, standing at the edge of the group, a satisfied look on her face, as if she had orchestrated it all. She was talking to one of the teachers now, but her eyes were fixed on my son, and in that look, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a smirk on her lips, a silent confirmation that this was not a simple misunderstanding. She was happy. She was winning. I didn't realize it at first, but that was the moment the real fear set in. It wasn't just about playground politics or petty exclusion. It was about something darker, something much more insidious. It was about the realization that there were people like her who would stop at nothing to make my son feel inferior, to make him believe that he didn't deserve a place in this world. And in that moment, I feared for my son's spirit more than I had ever feared for his physical safety. I watched as my son, heartbroken but trying to hold it together, rolled toward the swings, the one place he still found solace. But the same children who had once laughed with him now turned their backs. No one said a word, but the message was loud and clear: he wasn't welcome. And then, as if the universe had conspired against him, the teacher arrived, just as the woman had planned. She approached my son, and I saw her hand go to his shoulder, a gesture that, to anyone else, might have seemed innocent, even kind, but I could see the discomfort in my son's face. He didn't want her sympathy. He didn't want anyone to pity him. But this was more than that. She was taking her place in the story, cementing her role as the authority in the playground, the one who dictated who could stay and who had to leave. The woman leaned down, speaking to the teacher in a low voice, just loud enough for me to hear. "This isn't the place for him," she said, her words dripping with disdain. "He's a disruption. You should be encouraging him to leave before it gets worse." I felt a rush of anger, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My son, oblivious to the extent of the cruelty unfolding before him, looked up at me. His eyes were filled with uncertainty. He wasn't sure what was happening, but I was sure of one thing. This wasn't just about a playground anymore. This was about his future, his ability to see himself as worthy, as deserving of love and respect. And in that moment, I feared that this woman's poison was beginning to seep into his heart, that her words were beginning to take root in his mind. The teacher, unsure how to handle the situation, stood in silence for a moment, glancing back and forth between the woman and my son. But no one moved. The moment stretched out, filling the air with an uncomfortable weight. My son, still not fully understanding what was happening, remained silent, his face betraying the hurt he couldn't quite put into words. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a battle for a place at the playground. This was a battle for my son's dignity. And it was a fight I wasn't willing to lose. The fear I had been holding at bay now had a name. It wasn't just about protecting my son physically, it was about protecting him emotionally and psychologically from the kind of hatred that could break him if I didn't intervene. The stakes had been raised, and there was no turning back. I couldn't let her or anyone else win. This fight was just beginning, and it was one that would take everything I had to win. The tension that had been building steadily for weeks reached its breaking point one fateful afternoon. It wasn't a loud event, nor a dramatic outburst that set the stage. It was a moment that seemed like just another incident in the routine of a typical school day, but in reality, it was the spark that would ignite everything. My son had always been a fighter, even if he didn't realize it. His resilience, his ability to push through the whispers and the stares, had always been something I admired. But today, something felt different. The playground, once a place where he could lose himself in the joy of simple games, had become a place where every step, every roll of his wheelchair felt like an uphill battle. The whispers, the pointed glances, they had all coalesced into something much larger than anyone had expected. He had begun to pull away even more, hiding behind the safety of his chair, trying to avoid the world around him that had decided he didn't belong. It was during one of these moments, when he had rolled to the farthest corner of the playground, trying to escape the small circles of exclusion that had been growing tighter around him, that the woman made her move. She had been watching him all day, watching, waiting, observing every action, every slight movement that could give her the excuse she needed to escalate things further. I wasn't close enough to hear exactly what she said when she approached him, but I could see the confrontation unfolding from across the yard. My heart sank as I watched her step in front of my son's wheelchair, blocking his way. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there, a cold and unrelenting figure in the midst of the playground. My son, unaware of her growing hostility, looked up at her with a smile, his innocent expression betraying the confusion that would soon cloud his face. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice low but firm. It was not the first time she had said those words, but it was the first time they had been directed so viciously at him. The calmness in her voice only added to the cruelty of her message. My son froze. For a split second, I thought he might try to move around her, to continue his journey to the swings or the bench where he could sit quietly and watch the others play, but she didn't let him. She moved closer, her shadow looming over him like a dark cloud. "This playground isn't for kids like you," she said, her words slicing through the air, each one aimed at his very soul. "You're just taking up space, making it harder for the others to have fun." I could see the fear in his eyes, and it was like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the physical pain that hurt him. It was the emotional weight of being singled out in this way, the realization that someone in a position of power had decided that he didn't matter, that he wasn't enough. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair, but they trembled slightly as he tried to find the courage to speak. "I just want to play," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But the woman didn't relent. She wasn't listening to him. She wasn't interested in what he had to say. All she saw was a child in a wheelchair who didn't fit into her idea of what the playground should be. "You're a distraction," she continued, her voice now tinged with a sense of finality. "And if you can't keep up, maybe you should leave." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. It wasn't just the cruelty of her statement, it was the intent behind it. She wasn't trying to make him feel better. She wasn't trying to help him. She was trying to drive him out, to isolate him from the space where he should have been safe, where he should have been able to just be a kid. She had crossed the line from judgment to active exclusion. But the worst part, the part that sent a chill through my entire body, was when I saw her move her hand toward him. She reached down, not in a gesture of kindness or help, but with an intent that I could only describe as malicious. She grabbed the arm of his wheelchair, yanking it roughly. "Move it," she said sharply, her voice full of contempt. It all happened in an instant. The sudden movement of her hand, the panic in my son's eyes, the unsettling sound of his chair scraping against the pavement as she jerked it away from the group. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was an attack on his dignity, on his right to exist in this space, on his very identity as a child who deserved to be seen and heard. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran toward them, my heart pounding in my chest, but by the time I reached the playground, everything had already escalated far beyond what I could have imagined. The woman's actions had set off a chain of events. The other children had begun to gather around, drawn by the commotion. Some stood there in silence. Others seemed unsure of what to do, but one thing was clear: no one stepped in to stop it. The playground that was meant to be a place of inclusivity had become a stage for cruelty, and my son, the very one who needed protection, had become the target. By the time I reached him, the tears were already welling up in his eyes, and his face was a mask of confusion and hurt. He didn't understand why this woman was doing this to him. He didn't know what he had done to deserve this treatment, and I couldn't explain it to him. I couldn't give him an answer that made sense. But I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let this woman or anyone else make my son feel like he didn't belong. As I stood there, my son's trembling hands reaching out for me, I realized that this wasn't just a battle for playground space. This was a battle for his right to be seen, to be respected, to be heard. And if I had to fight every inch of the way, I would. No one was going to take his place in this world, not while I was standing beside him. The fight had only just begun, and this time, I wasn't going to back down. In the days that followed, the incident on the playground became a quiet storm. At first, it seemed like the world around my son was beginning to return to some semblance of normal. But that normal was a fragile illusion, a thin veil that was only held together by silence. The other children, no longer openly excluding him, began to whisper behind his back, their conversations always pausing when he entered the room. The playground, a space where he should have felt free and safe, had turned into a place of quiet judgment. The invisible wall that had been erected around him was becoming more suffocating with each passing day. But what terrified me most wasn't the subtle isolation. It was the way the school handled the situation. The teachers, once a support system that had stood by us in the past, now seemed unsure of how to respond. Some gave me sympathetic glances, but kept their distance. Others acted as though nothing had happened, as if the playground incident was simply a misunderstanding that could be swept under the rug. But I knew better. What had happened wasn't a simple altercation. It was a turning point, and the school's inability to address it only made the situation worse. I couldn't stand by and let this go unchallenged. So I requested a meeting with the school administration, hoping to address the issue head-on, to ensure that my son's rights were being respected, that his experience wasn't being diminished, and that the environment at school would be safe for him once again. What I didn't expect, however, was the pushback that came from the very institution that should have been there to support him. The meeting began with the principal, a well-meaning woman who spoke with all the right words but lacked the action to back them up. As we sat in her office, I explained the situation, detailing the incident with the woman on the playground and the subsequent change in my son's experience. I watched as her face softened, as if she were genuinely concerned. But as I spoke, I could feel the growing distance between her understanding and the reality I was trying to convey. "We take all incidents like this seriously," she said, her tone diplomatic. "But sometimes children don't always understand the implications of their actions. Maybe the other kids were just playing and didn't know how to include him in the game. Maybe this is just a phase." A phase? I fought the urge to scream. A phase? My son had been excluded, isolated, And now he was being told that his pain didn't matter, that it was just something temporary, something that could be brushed aside. But I knew it wasn't a phase. This wasn't a small misunderstanding. This was an ongoing pattern, one that was eating away at my son's self-worth. I don't think you understand, I said, my voice steady but firm. This isn't about a moment of exclusion. This is about a child who is made to feel like he's not even allowed to be a part of the world around him. This is about a child who's being told, time and time again, that he doesn't belong. And if you let this go, if you allow it to be swept under the rug, you're telling him that his place in this world doesn't matter. She looked at me, her eyes flickering with something like guilt, but there was still that disconnect. We'll monitor the situation, she said, almost too quickly. We'll talk to the kids, address the issue, and make sure everyone understands the importance of inclusion. But in the meantime, I'm sure things will get better on their own. But I knew that wasn't enough. Things didn't just get better on their own. People like the woman who had targeted my son didn't change unless they were held accountable. And this school needed to step up, not just in words, but in action. The days that followed the meeting were filled with a strange mixture of hope and dread. The school's administration assured me that they were working on it, but the subtle exclusion continued. My son, once so eager to attend school, now dreaded the mornings. His friends, once his greatest support, had begun to follow the unspoken rules set by the woman. Their avoidance wasn't always direct, but it was clear. He no longer joined in games with the other children. He spent his recess time sitting alone, his face a mixture of sadness and confusion. He began to ask questions that broke my heart. Why don't they want to play with me anymore? What's wrong with me? It was in those moments that I realized how much damage had already been done. The emotional toll this was taking on my son was far greater than I had initially realized. He was internalizing the rejection. He was beginning to believe that there was something wrong with him, something that made him less worthy of friendship, of love, of belonging. But I couldn't let that happen. I refused to let this woman's hatred, this system's indifference, break him. My son was strong, and I was going to make sure he knew that. I spent evenings with him talking about the importance of self-worth, about how people who excluded him didn't define who he was. I reminded him that his wheelchair didn't make him less than anyone else. It just made him different. And being different was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. Yet, the battle was far from over. The more I pushed for accountability, the more I realized just how deeply embedded this mindset was. I had heard rumors of other children with disabilities being excluded in similar ways. I wasn't the only parent dealing with this, and it wasn't just a one-time incident. The woman wasn't an anomaly. She was a symptom of a larger issue, an issue that ran deeper than a single schoolyard confrontation. I began to research, reaching out to advocacy groups for children with disabilities, finding allies who had faced similar struggles. Together, we started to speak out, to push for a more inclusive environment not just for my son, but for all children who were being left behind by a world that didn't understand their worth. The fight was hard, and at times it felt like we were swimming upstream. But I knew that if I didn't fight for my son, no one else would. This wasn't just about a playground incident anymore. This was about changing the narrative, about standing up for children like my son, who didn't always have a voice but deserved to be heard. And slowly things began to change. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but with persistence and support, we started to make a difference. The school, although initially resistant, began to take stronger steps toward inclusion. They implemented programs that educated the children about disability and diversity. Teachers were trained to recognize exclusion and to intervene when necessary. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And it gave me hope, a hope that my son would one day walk into that school and know, without a doubt, that he belonged. As the weeks went by, the changes, though slow, began to have a noticeable impact. The school had begun implementing some of the inclusion programs we had pushed for, while the woman's overt actions had temporarily silenced the children who had once played with my son, there was a subtle shift in the dynamics of the playground. The whispers had not completely stopped, but there was now a constant, though often unspoken, awareness among the teachers and other parents. The school, after much prodding, began to address what had been happening. But that wasn't the full story. What I hadn't realized and what no one had prepared me for was the truth behind the woman's actions, the truth that would come to light in a way I never expected. I had spent my time focused on the visible enemy, the woman who had targeted my son, who had made it her mission to tear him down with each cruel word. I had fought against the isolation she created, the sense of alienation she cultivated. But the more I dug into the situation, the more I realized that there was something darker, something much more insidious at play. She wasn't just a single person with misguided views about my son. She was part of a much larger network of people who had long held these harmful beliefs, people who had, in a way, normalized exclusion, even in the most subtle forms. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from one of the other parents, a mother of a child who had been in the same class as my son. She had heard about the confrontation between the woman and my son and was deeply troubled by it. After a long conversation, she revealed something I hadn't expected. This woman, let's call her Mrs. Harris, wasn't just a random figure in the school. She had connections with several parents who held similar views on children with disabilities. They believed, as she did, that kids like my son didn't belong in mainstream schools. They saw disability as something that should be hidden away and managed in separate environments. And Mrs. Harris, as I learned, had been subtly spreading these harmful views to other parents, trying to convince them that children with disabilities were a disruption to the normal educational experience. It shocked me to my core. I had thought the issue was isolated, a personal vendetta from a single person. But what I was learning now was that this wasn't just one woman's prejudice, it was a network of exclusion, and I was only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Mrs. Harris had been strategically aligning herself with like-minded individuals, sowing seeds of division throughout the school community. She was one of the unspoken ringleaders of an underground movement that viewed my son's presence in the school as a threat to their children's education. What was most terrifying was how covert it was. These views weren't shouted from rooftops or openly declared in meetings. They were whispered, subtly suggested in private conversations, and slowly embedded into the mindset of certain parents and even some staff members. I couldn't help but feel betrayed. Betrayed not just by Mrs. Harris, but by a system that had allowed such toxicity to grow unchecked. For months, I had fought to protect my son from one person, not realizing that I was up against a belief system that permeated deeper than I had ever imagined. I knew that the fight wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. But this revelation changed the game. It wasn't enough to confront Mrs. Harris. I now had to challenge the broader culture that allowed her and people like her to thrive. If I was going to protect my son, if I was going to ensure that he had a place in this world, then I couldn't just rely on a few inclusion programs. I needed to push for a larger shift in the school's entire culture. With the help of the parent who had reached out to me, we began to organize. We started talking to other parents, gathering their support. We weren't just advocating for my son anymore. We were advocating for every child who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong because they were different. We set up meetings with teachers, administrators, and the school board, demanding that they take a hard look at the prejudices that were festering under the surface. We pushed for real, tangible change, a school environment that didn't just tolerate difference but celebrated it. But it wasn't just about the school anymore. As I learned more about the people behind Mrs. Harris's views, I realized that this kind of discrimination wasn't unique to this school. It was widespread, it was entrenched in the way society viewed disability, and it was something that needed to be tackled head-on if we were ever going to change the future for my son and countless others. It wasn't easy. The pushback was strong. Many of the parents who had been influenced by Mrs. Harris were reluctant to change their views, and there were still whispers in the hallways, still stares and sideways glances. But something was shifting. With every meeting, with every conversation, With every parent who stepped forward to support us, I could see the change beginning to take root. And then there was a breakthrough. The school board, after months of pressure, finally agreed to hold a mandatory workshop on inclusion and disability awareness for both staff and parents. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. It was the first time the school had truly acknowledged that something was wrong, that the system was flawed, and that it needed to be corrected. But the real victory wasn't in the workshops, the meetings, or the changes at school. It was in my son's face, in the way he began to stand a little taller, roll a little faster, laugh a little louder. He hadn't given up, and neither had I. Together, we were making a difference, not just for him, but for every child who came after him, every child who was different, every child who was made to feel like they didn't belong. The road ahead would be long, and I knew the battle was far from over. But we had taken the first step, and that was something no one could ever take away from us. The world had tried to exclude my son, but I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be excluded. The resolution to this long and painful journey didn't come suddenly, nor did it come easily. It was something that was built on the small victories, on the conversations, the changes, the support of others, and on my unwavering belief that my son, and every child like him, deserved more than the world had been willing to give. It wasn't a neat ending, nor was it perfect, but it was a turning point, and that in itself was worth everything. As the months passed, we saw real shifts, not just in the way the school was structured, but in the mindset of the community around it. The inclusion workshops we had pushed for became a cornerstone of the school's new approach, opening the door for parents and teachers alike to engage in real discussions about the biases that had silently pervaded their perceptions of disability. Slowly, as more people became aware of the issue, the whispers of exclusion faded, replaced by open conversations and, more importantly, actions. The change wasn't immediate, and it wasn't flawless. There were still moments when my son faced rejection, subtle or not so subtle. But those moments became fewer and fewer. The kids, once distant, started to come around. They asked more questions, learned more, and began to see him for the child he was, not just for his wheelchair. Slowly, my son's place in the world became more secure. His laughter, once tentative and uncertain, began to ring out more often. The playground was still not the utopia I had dreamed of, but it had become a place where my son could find a corner, a space, and sometimes even an embrace. But the most significant change came in the form of the community around him. Parents who had once been influenced by the negative views of people like Mrs. Harris began to speak out. They approached me, some apologizing for their silence, others offering their support. It wasn't easy for them to confront the biases they had once silently held. But once they saw the truth, once they realized the harm that had been done, not just to my son, but to all the children who were made to feel less, they knew they had to change. One of the most powerful moments came when the principal finally acknowledged the problem publicly. She organized a school-wide event where parents, teachers, and students could hear stories from families who had been affected by exclusion. I was invited to speak, to tell our story, our struggle, our pain, and ultimately our victory. It was a moment of catharsis for me, but it was more than that. It was an opportunity for everyone in that room to see firsthand what exclusion really looked like, how it affected lives in ways that were far deeper than any physical difference. When I stood before the room, I spoke not just for my son, but for every child who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. I spoke for the parents who were afraid of being too loud, for the teachers who had stood by but hadn't intervened, for the children who didn't know how to stand up for their peers. I spoke with the hope that through my words they would understand the impact of their actions or inaction and how they had the power to change the world. The event ended with a standing ovation. I could see it in the faces of the parents, the teachers, even some of the children, the understanding, the awareness, the desire to do better. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was a small victory in the ongoing battle to make the world more inclusive, and for my son, it was a moment of validation. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was seen not as the boy in the wheelchair, but as the boy who had fought for his place. However, Even with all the progress, I knew this journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The fight for inclusion, for fairness, for acceptance was an ongoing battle. But the most powerful lesson I learned throughout this experience was that change didn't have to be big or grand to be meaningful. Sometimes it was the small steps, the conversations, the moments of self-reflection, the willingness to step out of comfort zones that made the biggest difference. The road ahead was still long, but it was filled with hope. And I knew that, together with my son, with all the parents and allies who had joined us, we would continue to fight for a world where everyone had a place, where no one was made to feel invisible simply because they were different. We would continue to push for inclusion, to ensure that every child, no matter their differences, could walk into any room and know that they were worthy, that they belonged. As I watched my son that evening, rolling down the hallway with his friends, laughing and joking as if nothing had changed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had fought, not just for himself, but for every child who would come after him. And in that moment, I realized that the true victory wasn't in the change that had been made at the school or in the minds of the parents. The true victory was in my son, his strength, his resilience, and his ability to inspire those around him to be better, to be kinder, and to see the world not through a lens of exclusion, but through one of love and acceptance. This story, our story, doesn't end here. It's not just about one moment of triumph. It's about creating a lasting change. And for anyone who believes that change isn't possible, that we're too small to make a difference, I say this: change starts with one voice, one person, one family. And when we stand together, when we refuse to let anyone be silenced, that is when the world begins to change. So, to everyone who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, to everyone who has been judged for something they can't control, know that your place in this world is not defined by the cruelty of others. Stand tall, stand proud, and know that you are worthy. You belong. And as for us, we'll keep fighting for every child, for every person who deserves to be seen. Because no one should have to fight alone. If you've been moved by this story and believe that every child deserves to be seen, heard, and accepted for who they truly are, then join us in spreading the message of inclusion. Let's make the world a kinder, more understanding place, one step at a time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment below and let us know how you've experienced or overcome exclusion, and together we can continue to raise awareness. Remember, every voice matters, and with your support, we can create a community of love and acceptance for all. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more powerful stories from the HOA Stories. Let's continue this journey together.